Today I'm going to talk a little bit about motor oil, and this is not your average everyday motor oil discussion. You're going to get some stuff out of this you didn't know, I guarantee it. There's just so much more that can be said about it than even I'm saying today. But let me start out on this opening slide. Long years ago, I'm talking about 40, 50 years ago, there was a myth that was circulating around this part of the country. I don't know if it was everywhere, that if you used Quaker State motor oil, that you would wind up sludging up your engine. But that wasn't true. There was never anything wrong with Quaker State motor oil. That's just the way it is. But the problem was short trips where you didn't warm the vehicle up, and a lot of people around this part of the country did that. Other places where you had to drive 20 miles to get to town, like in parts of Texas, they didn't have that problem, but around here they did, because it's short distances that a lot of people went, and farmers used it in their trucks, and they'd crank the truck up and they'd go down to the cattle gate and they'd piddle around, and they'd go another 100 yards and they'd park and they'd piddle around working on the fence, and it wound up sledging up their vehicles. But it wasn't Quaker State oil that did it. Quaker State oil is as good as any other oil. And so I just wanted to put that aside. You may not have ever heard that, but there was our shop foreman one time made a remark about that, because he had heard that for a long time, but he was wrong about it. And Quaker State, it got back to them that he had told somebody that, and they called him up and scared the daylights out of him and said, "Don't you ever say that about our oil again." But the simple fact was, what he believed was wrong, and you can be taught something so long that you'll believe it's right when it's actually not. Now, before we start, I want to invite you to visit my friends at the carsloves.com. It's a podcast where people tell stories about their favorite cars and all this. I'm going to be on it pretty soon. I've actually already done the podcast interview, and most of the interviews are only 25, 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes long. Long and the short of it is, it's a really good podcast, and I'd appreciate if you guys would give it some support and visit it and see what you think about it. American Petroleum Institute program, API, you've heard of that, certifies oil meets certain original equipment manufacturer quality and performance standards. You're going to look at these numbers over here. The higher that number is, see, the second letter, spark fired is what S means. If it's compression fired, it will have a C in this spot right here. Well, this spark fired oil here, the higher you go on the alphabet right here, the better the oil is, the higher the classification of the oil is. And you might notice this chart down here, the qualifications for engine oil kept going up and up and up, farther you got into the 21st century. Now, SAE is a numerical system for grading motor oils according to viscosity, and the suffix is 0, 5, 10, 15, what you're going to see right here, and 25, followed by the letter W, designates winter. W does not stand for weight, it stands for winter. And there are people who will argue with you about that, but all you have to do is look it up. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this multi-grade oil here. Now, which oil to use when you're picking it? You need to know more than correct viscosity, full or synthetic blend, correct API or AC rating. What else we need to know? More than you think. Well, high mileage oil, for example, has additives to soften the seals and keep, maybe slow down some leaks. Because seals get hard, and that's when they leak, and they put esters in this oil, this high mileage oil, to help with the leaks. Now, not all oils are created equal. They are miscible. That's a word, miscible. That means that you can mix the oils without causing a problem, but you need to predominantly use the kind of, like, for example, if you're on a trip and you wind up in your, you've got full synthetic and you're low, and all you can find is the oil that's in the gas station, and you can actually pour a quart of that in there to save your engine instead of running it low. Ford Motor Company put out a bulletin a long time ago that said if a crankcase is set for 5 quarts and you run it on 4 quarts of oil, in other words, if you run it a quart low, when it gets a quart low, the engine oil breaks down twice as fast. So if you put 4 quarts in a 5-quart engine, you're only going to get about 1,500 miles out of that 4 quarts of oil in a 5-quart engine until it starts to break down. So just keep that in mind. It's one of the reasons why it's important to keep your engine oil topped up. But anyway, the analysis of oil that's been drained from the same vehicle is a good indicator of the wear that's happening in an engine. I got a story about that a little bit later. So different base stock, different levels of additives, this is what makes oil more expensive. Different manufacturing processes. Now, do these differences have a meaningful effect on how it's wearing? Well, yeah, they do. There's companies, though, that do oil analysis. You can buy a kit on Amazon for like $35, and you can send some of your oil to Blackstone, and they'll analyze it and send you the results. And that's really important information. The military has used this kind of thing. I know they did on aircraft for a long time, that aircraft that had combustion engines and all. They would always analyze the oil to see what was wearing out on the inside. That's what the numbers look like when they analyze it. Basically, these are the engine wear levels. If any of these is high, you're going to know that there's a certain amount of wear. Of course, these are worn out bearings, and that's a piston that's galled on the side and all this. Aluminum, chromium, iron, copper, and lead. And then these are all additives: molybdenum, boron, sodium, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc. The count is the number of samples of each oil type, and miles is the average oil change interval for that engine oil combination. Now here's your metals. Lead is bushings and rod bearing. Iron is, cylinder, liners, rings, crankshaft, camshaft, rods, valves, train oil, pump, gear, wrist pins. You can freeze this slide and study these later and see where this comes from. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading all of these to you because it's pointless, because everybody watching this can read. So I'm going to move on. Now, calcium, magnesium, and sodium are detergent dispersant additives, and they provide alkalinity to help neutralize acids formed from diesel fuel combustion, and also in gasoline engines you have acid forming too. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Sodium helps disperse heat. That's why some of your valves, like your intake and exhaust valves, will have sodium. They will be sodium filled because it disperses heat better. And of course, don't ever grind your way into a valve that has sodium in the center of it, because when that thing hits the air, it can explode, and I'm talking violent. You can look up on YouTube where people have done that, and this one kid did that in a kind of a shop environment out there that he had behind his house or whatever, and that explosion was violent enough to where it's surprising that it didn't seriously injure that kid. So don't be grinding around on valve stems or something, because if you get into that sodium, you're going to get hurt. Zinc, phosphorus, and boron are anti-wear additives, and molybdenum is a friction modifier, because you might remember the black grease, the moly grease, that's molybdenum in that grease, and it modifies friction. It's kind of like graphite, but it's different, And so 15% to 25% of the oil is additives: viscosity index improvers, dispersants to prevent sludge, pour point depressants, anti-foaming additives. That's really important in your Power Stroke diesels that have oil operated injectors. Detergents to prevent acid formation, rust and corrosion inhibitors, antioxidants, anti-wear agents to reduce wear under heavy load and high temperatures. Now, antioxidants slow down the breakdown of the base stock due to oxygen and heat. Oxidation of base stock causes acid that contributes to corrosion, sludge, varnish. And a long time ago I was reading a periodical that said 95% of engine wear is due to acid content that is formed like this in the oil. That's one of the reasons it's so important to get regular oil changes. And to be perfectly honest, even though the oil change intervals on my vehicles are usually like 7,500 miles or whatever, I won't go over 5,000, and on most of the time I'll only go 3,000 before I change the oil. That's just really important. That's just about as important as the kind of oil you use, to tell you the truth. Now, your synthetic oils will take you more miles, and if uncalled for synthetic oil and we change the oil, we always put exactly the right synthetic oil back in it. I'll talk about that a little bit more again in a minute. The old hot water V8 engines would do just fine with just about any motor oil. They weren't really choosy, but in the 60s, if you got 100,000 miles out of a vehicle and without the engine wearing down and starting to burn oil, you were doing really good. I mean, if it went 100,000 miles and it was still running, that was a doggone good vehicle. That's different. Today's vehicles, ever since the 90s, there was this lady that, I've seen all kinds of vehicles, like some of the Jeep Cherokees that I would see. They started building the Jeep Cherokees with that 4-liter in the late 1980s and 87, as a matter of fact. And some of those vehicles would have 400,000 miles on them, and the people would keep that Jeep and buy another one. I don't know how many times I saw that, but it became more and more common up in the late 80s and early 90s, and on up to now, for a lot of these vehicles to get 300,000-400,000 miles on them, and the engine still runs just fine. But it has a lot to do. It doesn't have anything to do with whether it's a Toyota or a Nissan. Any vehicle that you maintain properly is going to last a long time. The crazy thing about, and I'm not against Japanese cars, I've said this before, but I had this guy call me one time and said he had bought a pickup and he felt like he was making a really wise decision by buying a Japanese brand of pickup because he felt like it would last a lot longer. And I told him, I said, that's not going to last any longer than any other vehicle. But a lot of times, when I worked at the dealership up here, the Volkswagen Mazda dealership, I noticed that a lot of the work we did was when people would bring those cars in to have that, every little box in that maintenance book, they make doggone sure it was checked off at just about exactly the right mileage, because they would have a vision for that car that it was going to last them 500,000 miles, and so they would hedge that bet. But the same people would drive a Ford or a Chevrolet or a Dodge and they'd beat the stuffings out of it without ever changing the oil. And then whenever they had trouble with it because of the way they treated it, they'd claim, well, it's not as good as my Toyota, which gets a perfect oil change every time and all that. Any vehicle you have, you're typically going to do okay with it, with a few exceptions, if you keep the oil changed and you make sure it's got everything done the way it's supposed to be. Follow that maintenance guide. I always like to use the severe table. In other words, the more frequent oil changes than the $7,500 one. I mean, 7,500 mile ones and all that. Anyway, viscosity is the oil's resistance to flow via gravity at a particular temperature. The higher the number, the greater resistance. Like mayonnaise would have a higher viscosity than ketchup. But don't put those in the crankcase. That just wouldn't be a good plan. Multi-viscosity, the colder oil is, it's like honey, the thicker it'll be. With a multi-viscosity oil, the thickness can be changed to vary with temperature, so it's not too thick when it's cold and it's not too thin when it's hot. And so that's really important, especially on a lot of these engines that have these oil-driven time and chain tensioners and these oil-driven cam phasers and all that kind of stuff. The perfect viscosity of oil needs to be used along with the OEM specs. Have got to be followed very carefully, or you will have issues with the way the thing runs and can cause bigger problems later on. 5W30 is as thin as a 5 winter oil when it's measured at -22, but it's as thick as a 30 when the oil, see, people like to say weight, but it's not weight, it's winter. When the viscosity of the oil is at 212, it acts like a 30 weight oil. See, I said it then. You get used to saying that and it just burns in. 30W, just call it W if you don't want to say winter, but weight's not the right term. But you can read that slide and tell what's going on there. There's a hidden viscosity number, though, is the resistance to pouring, but there's also the oil's resistance to being stirred. Because, the crankshaft, when you're spinning this thing over when it's cold, what is that crankshaft doing? It's stirring the oil that's in the oil pan. And there's a lot of splash oil lubricant, there's pressurized bearings and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of the stuff, and some of your timing chains and stuff like that are inside, those are lubricated by splash oil. And the oil is just splashing, throwing it all over everything, I mean, that's why it's important that the stirring And that's sort of a hidden viscosity number. The point is, these oil life monitors, some are mileage based. It's basically an electronic oil change ticker. There's monitors that measure mileage and modify the warning trigger by time and temperature. There's others that measure engine idle time. You know, Ford, particularly the diesels have that, but a lot of the Ford trucks have got that now. You can actually find out how much time the engine has run, regardless of how many miles it has gone, and that's important. Short trips, though, that don't operate it long enough to evaporate moisture cause sludge, acid, and corrosion, and the oil breaks down because of it. But the two types that aren't trustworthy, you know, there's a bunch of oil monitors that aren't trustworthy, but the one that is would be the one used like on a 6.7 Power Stroke, and there's other ones that use it, and use an oil quality sensor, and there's also algorithms used to determine. Now, my wife's pickup truck is got very few miles on it for the year model it is, because we just don't drive it very much, and we have typically changed the oil on that thing once a year ever since 2016. But the thing about it is, when it hadn't had the oil changed for a year, we don't idle it. We don't let it be cold and running and idling. I'm sorry, we don't switch it off before it warms up either. We make sure we warm it up every time we go crank that thing up, because I have, you know, beat that into the way that we do our vehicles. And when I pulled the valve covers off of my Explorer, you might have seen that video, you know, a couple, 3 months ago. It had a little, you know, it didn't look like a brand new engine, but it didn't have sludge in it either. And that's one of the things you need to do, is keep that sludge out of there. That sludge gets down in the oil pan, clogs up the screen, starves the motor for oil. And, you know, you can't blame it on the engine if you got it all sludged up. But anyway, you need to make sure that you don't trust that oil change reminder too much, because if you do, you're liable to go too far between oil changes and cause big problems. And the oil change reminder, just ignore that. Follow your mileage, and if you're going to do seasonal oil changes like we do, that's fine. But see, right now, her F-150 is saying change the oil, but it's only been about 800 miles since the last oil change. So I'm not sure exactly what criteria it's using, because I know that the oil is not nasty on this. You can pull the oil dipstick out and the oil looks clean, you know. So, but one thing another, ours, I'm trusting it on the other side, because the oil, see, I can actually reset that, because I don't really think it needs an oil change, although I'm going to do one pretty quick. Anyway, I could go on about that for a while. And this was a funny story I thought you might appreciate as oil related. This guy I worked with, he didn't know much of anything about a vehicle, but he was a very fastidious guy. And the timing chain broke on his GMC. He was working with us there in the shop when I was doing fleet maintenance, but he didn't know anything about vehicles. He barely knew how to use a wrench. Well, it bent all the valves because the timing chain broke. I said, the timing chain broke on a Chevy 350? I can't believe this. GM 350. Well, I asked how many miles were on it. He said he bought it with 2,500 miles on it, but the odometer had stopped working at 385,000, and so he didn't know how many miles were on it. I guarantee you this thing had over 400,000 miles on it. Well, this was the first trouble he'd had. An engine in those days, like I said earlier, was good about 100,000 miles. So I discovered this guy had religiously changed his oil every 1,500 miles. He didn't even know that was unusual. He didn't ask anybody. He just said, well, 1,500 miles is a long way. I should probably do an oil change every time it hits 1,500 miles. And that's what he had done for the previous 400,000 or so miles. And that's why he got so many miles out of a 350 that ordinarily would have been worn out at 100,000 miles. Learn from this. And also keep your dipstick pulled out. There's some of these little Kia vehicles burn oil, and they actually have a reflash that they do at the dealership, so that if it gets low on engine oil, it'll flash the check engine light, which every other vehicle just says that when you got a misfire. But anyway, synthetic oil has got superior low temperature properties, better high temperature stability, lower volatility, means it won't catch fire as easy, longer oil life, and it doesn't burn as easy, and responds better to additives. And when they're required, you need to use them. This Chrysler Crossfire I got pictured up here takes, as I remember, 9 quarts of synthetic oil, but it's 10,000 miles between oil changes. And you know, somebody can talk really neat stuff about that. Well, I've don't worry about changing my oil until whatever. Some people will say, why do I need an oil change? My car still runs okay. I've actually heard people say those words. And I was thinking, this is the wackiest thing I've ever heard. Always err on the side of caution. Now look at this. This is important. Dexos is really important to use in GM cars. That is their OEM spec. And you might see somebody that buys Mobil 1 thinking, well, Mobil 1 is bound to be perfectly okay because it's full synthetic, and after all, Mobil 1 is Mobil 1. But if it doesn't have this Dexos approved badge on it, you don't need to use that. If it calls for this, it doesn't matter how good you may think this oil is. You need something that says, that's the specs for your vehicle call for. And that's there was a story about that that one of my friends actually published in an article, and he had, to begin with, he paid attention, he trusted his oil change reminder, and he didn't realize that it was telling him he still had 40% oil left when he had 11,000 miles on it. Started hearing a noise, and he found out that he had gone too far without an oil change, trusting that oil change reminder. Secondly, he had been using plain old Mobil 1 in it instead of using Dexos approved, because he thought, well, this is so expensive and it's so good, and it says NASCAR on it. I mean, after all, this ought to be fine. The thing about it is, it wasn't. Make sure you're using the right oil for the application, particularly if you have a newer car. Now, if you're driving a 68 Chevy pickup truck, with one of those little hot water engines in it, you could pretty much pour any oil in there and you'll be okay. This guy right here on his Mustang saw a video online about oil analysis. He decided to give it a try. He got his first report back. He noticed excess aluminum, but he didn't think too much of it. Later that year, he sent another one back, and it came back with a lot of aluminum in it, and he couldn't see anything, he couldn't hear anything. It ran really good. But he took it to a shop, and so he requested that the shop that he trusted check the oil pressure and use a borescope to check the time and chain and tensioners. And the chains had worn through this worn through this plastic and or that nylon or whatever it is, and got into the aluminum, and they were shelling aluminum off of these timing chain sliders, and that prevented him from having a really costly engine repair because they caught it early. And anything that you can do to catch something early is going to help you in the long run, particularly in regard to this engine stuff. Now this is some fun stuff right here. Remember the Dukes of Hazzard car jumps? And that's the Gone in 60 Seconds car jump. The Dukes of Hazzard went through 10 Dodge Chargers per episode, and they had 75 of them on hand they were constantly fixing up. But the difference between Gone in 60 Seconds and Dukes of Hazzard is this General Lee car always had to look perfect without a scratch on it. If you watch a lot of these jump scenes, you could tell the car was damaged after it jumped, but they would always show them driving when it was really nice and pristine. It was like this thing was bulletproof and you couldn't hurt it. But in real life, it would get bashed up every time they made a jump. That's why they had to have 75 of them, use 10 of them per episode. This Mustang, Helicki owned this vehicle and the other 93 cars that were destroyed in that car chase. If you haven't seen Gone in 60 Seconds 1974, you should watch it because it's one of the best car chase movies you'll ever see. Anyway, this Mustang right here still runs. If you get the copy of the DVD with special features on it, there's a guy that bought this car, the same car that you see right here, and it was the only Mustang used in this whole car chase. But they didn't care what it looked like. It could be smashed up or bashed up or whatever. But the guy said this thing still runs, but you have to drive it really hard. If you don't drive it really hard, it will overheat. But if you drive it really hard, it won't overheat. And he was there. They had a video of him on that DVD special features on this old Mach 1 spinning donuts out there in the dirt. I thought that was just so cool. Another thing, this Mr. Majestic movie, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but this was a used 68 Ford pickup. And it was just box stock. It wasn't modified to do all this stuff. And Ford Motor Company used some of the clips from this movie to advertise how tough their trucks were. But they didn't do anything to make this truck survive those jumps. They just did the jumps on it. And I'm sure they used more than one of these trucks, but the long and the short of it is, there was a lot of them, they didn't cut the film, and you could actually see the truck bounce and keep going, you know. And that's a tall jump for any vehicle right there. Now this frame strength, I saw this at a shop. Actually, I think it was a Nissan dealer, and it was really odd that the Nissan dealer would have a Ford and a Chevrolet in the same shop. This was the same day at the same time, and I had seen this on a trainer truck I have. When we would jack it up on the lift, it would sag. My buddy that owned a tire store raised a Chevrolet pickup truck that had a real heavy load in the bed. It broke the frame in half, and his car and his insurance had to pay for another frame for that truck. But this Ford right here was the same generation as my F-150. This one here is like a 2002 or 3 model. Look how it's sagging. When you raise it up on the lift, you put it up on the lift, and it's the rear end of it droops. But this one here doesn't. It's firm and straight all the way back. And they're both in the same shop, same lift. Not the same lift, but it was the same day on 2 different lifts. And like I say, I'm not hating on any particular car, but it is what it is. You tell the truth or you don't. Some people will say, well, I don't care if it does sag. I would drive a Chevrolet before I would carry a Ford hubcap or something like that. Or I would carry a Chevrolet hubcap before I'd drive a Ford, blah, blah, blah. And that's okay. You know, ever to each his own. Now, another reason oil fails, which is pretty, dilution from overly rich mixtures, use of unauthorized oil additives. You pour something in there that doesn't belong there, you're going to change the formulation of the oil. Severe driving styles. The harder you drive it, the tougher it's going to get. My buddy Donnie said that there's one guy that comes and gets his oil changed at his shop. In every single one of his vehicles, the guy goes 3,000 miles before he changed it, but when Donnie drains the oil out, it's perfectly clear and clean. And he said, how do you keep your oil so clean? Because he's just using the regular OEM filter, you know. And the guy says, I just don't drive it hard. I drive it really gentle, like I'm afraid I'm going to tear it up. And I always have clean oil, which is pretty good. But these, you can break them down, break down the additive package driving too severely. Phantom engine ground issues can lead to micro-arcing. And what happens there is when that micro-arcing takes place, it actually, you know, anytime you got an arc, it burns a little metal away. And so that's a crazy thing, but it also changes the carbon chain length of the oil, and now you've got the incorrect viscosity. So you're changing the qualities of the oil, plus you're burning little pits in the bearings and stuff, you know. So, a few final tips here. Always use the right oil. In other words, don't just throw anything in there if you're doing a whole oil change. Now, if you're having to pour some oil in there to save the engine because it's low and you can't get the right kind, that's different. This one guy, speaking of that kind of thing, was telling me, he was an old man, it was a welder, and he said he was out there somewhere, and I don't remember, he busted a brake line or something, lost all the brake fluid in the old car that him and his wife and his kids were on. And he didn't have no brake fluid. He was able to fix the brake line, but he had no brake fluid. And he didn't want to call anybody to tow him in, so he filled the whole brake system up with water. And he says, and he had it bled out just like you would brake fluid. And he goes, and it stopped the car just fine all the way home. Of course, he didn't stop all that hard. He says, but when he got home, he flushed all that water out and replaced it with brake fluid, you know. You know, you do what you got to do to save, you know, to get yourself back home and to, you know, save your vehicle too. Don't trust the electronic oil change reminder. Talked about that earlier. Always warm the engine up before you shut it off. Don't crank it and shut it off. That bothers me about used car lots, because they move their cars around on the lot all the time. And they'll crank it up and they'll move it over here to a different place. They don't want it to look like the same cars are lined up the same way every day, because it looks like nothing's going on, nobody's buying anything. But what they don't think about when they're moving the cars around is that they're not warming it up. And that's just a bad idea. Alright, repair any, the 125 and 128 are codes that tell you the engine is running too cool. As soon as you start getting that code, check engine light, pull the code if it's a 125 or a 128. 125 usually means the thermostat's opening too soon, and 128 usually means it's stuck wide open. Now, a 125 on some of your Toyotas means the upstream oxygen sensor is, one of the oxygen sensors is not getting warm. I just wackiest thing. My son had a 98 Camry that was throwing 125 because the oxygen sensor wasn't heating up. I don't know what in the world they typed that algorithm for on that car, but it's not like that on anything else. Well, have a great week. I'm glad you guys watched. And be careful, and don't forget to check out carsloved.com and hear some of their podcasts. See you next week.